I'm Bayley Mizelle, the director of the Photographic Arts Council Los Angeles. Today we're joined by Alia Malley and Douglas Marshall. Thank you for joining us today, Alia and Douglas.
Thank you for having us. I'm super excited.
For inviting me.
So everyone, I'm just going to give you a little spiel about PAC, thank a few of our supporters, and then I'll give you a background on Alia, a quick run of show, and then we'll get started. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time today, PAC-LA is a nonprofit organization that fosters education, scholarship, and advocacy of the photographic and lens-based arts. We are made up of our membership and board of directors who are collectors, photographers, students, educators, and curators. To learn more about PAC-LA and to visit some content from Alia, just enjoy the links that I'll add in the chat shortly. Before we get started, I just wanted to send a note of gratitude to our board of directors, membership, community partners, and sponsors. Thank you for your ongoing support and commitment to PAC-LA's growth, our programming, and building our community. Just for a quick run of show, there'll be a quick 40 to 45-minute presentation by Alia.
It doesn't sound quick, but that's all right.
Well, I think the conversation will be long, and I'll jump into that. But we'll have a 40 to 45-minute presentation with Alia. At any point during the presentation, please add your questions and comments in the Q&A and chat. And then Alia has also asked that if you have any of these questions or comments while she's presenting, feel free to prompt them as we are moving through the presentation, and we'll get to them as they come. And then we'll also have a more concentrated conversation towards the end with Douglas and Alia and myself. Anything to add there, Alia?
I don't think so. If you can just keep score of the chat in case I miss stuff, that'd be great. I have a woodpecker somewhere, so you may hear a woodpecker.
That'd be charming.
Spring has sprung in LA and West LA.
Alia, you know you've said it. Okay, so just a quick background on Alia, and then we'll get started, everyone. Alia Malley is a Los Angeles-based artist. She received her BA in Critical Film Studies from the University of Southern California School of Cinematic Arts, and her MFA in Visual Arts from the University of California Riverside. She works with photography and video to explore modes of representation, specifically the roles of landscape, cinematic narrative of place, technology, and human geography and structures of power. Ooh,
I know. Oh my gosh, that sounds so fancy.
Love it. Okay, everyone. So I'm going to add some links in the chat so you can learn more about PAC, but also Alia and some content, and then the exhibition page from the exhibition. And just quickly about Douglas. Douglas is the founder and gallerist for Marshall Gallery, and he currently has an exhibition up with Alia. It's a 3-artist exhibition. So while we're talking and speaking on the curatorial of the exhibition, Douglas will jump in and join us and talk about the making of the exhibition and all of those things. So I'm going to pass it over to Alia. Please visit some links in the chat following our talk, and please add your questions and comments, and we'll get to them as we go.
Cool. Thank you so much, Bayley, for having me, and to PAC-LA for inviting me. I'm super excited. I have a lot of long-term friends and supporters in PAC-LA, so I'm super happy to be here, and for Douglas to join me today. So before I launch into the images, I just wanted to tell you a little bit sort of more about my background, and then we'll start with the first project. But as Bayley mentioned, I did go to USC at that time. It was called not the School of Cinematic Arts. It was a long time ago. It was the School of Cinema Television, because that was how, I guess, time-based media was limited in the early 90s. I was in the critical studies program. I was trying to take these production classes and tell these stories at 24 frames a second, and was having a hard time sort of understanding how a single frame was made. So at that time, the film school had a still photo department, which I think is long gone, but I started taking these still photo classes there to sort of understand how like one frame is made. It was a pretty technical program. Not that any of that really rubbed off on me, but it was sort of, I think, my first sort of inquiry into like learning photography. So that was that. I also was trying at a certain point to actually get a degree in music as well. A lot of people don't know that. I don't really talk about it, but that was sort of a stop-start failure. I had this idea I was going to score films, and I was sort of torn between film and music and photography and all of the above. And I ended up dropping the music because it just was not happening, staying in the film program, graduating, and then taking a job at a record company called 4AD. So this is the early 90s. It was this British indie record company. It was a lot of fun. I worked there for a couple of years and then decided to quit to, quote unquote, be a photographer. So I didn't really know what that meant. but I had a camera and I guess a lot of hustle and tried to make it happen. And it was in the mid 90s. So it was a lot of bands, music magazines. It was like the era of ray gun, if anybody knows that. You could sort of get away with a lot, like just like doing a whole shoot with Polaroids and turning it in or whatever. I moved to New York at that point to continue chasing this big photography career that I thought I wanted in sort of editorial and commercial work. And I got there and I hated it. So it was like early 2000s. And I lasted maybe 3 years there. And I was like, this is not the relationship that I want with photography. So I also hadn't seen the horizon line in like 6 months. And so much of my work is obviously landscape and horizon based on some level. And so I sort of made a deal with myself. I'm like, you're leaving New York, but you're going to apply to grad school. And excuse me, I ended up at UCR, UC Riverside. And at the time, I really wanted to study with John Davola and Uta Barth because she was still there. So she retired the semester before I started the program. So I ended up with John Davola, but I also ended up meeting Amir Zaki and Brandon Latu and working also with the historian Liz Coates, who had just arrived. So I arrived at UCR working with an 8x10 camera. I had been making projects on my own for a little bit with an 8x10. I think I really enjoyed not only the fidelity of the negative and the quality of the prints that those giant negatives provided, but it requires, for anybody that has worked with large format, it requires a super slow, sort of methodic way of working and a lot of pre-visualization. I one time calculated that each sheet of film between film and processing and printing was about $20 a pop. So you had to be very sort of committed to what you were working on. And I sort of realized within a few months of being in grad school that I needed to work faster. I needed to work cheaper. I needed to be able to work through ideas sort of quicker. And so I moved down to a 4x5 camera. And then, and sort of a series of like unlucky events, like the camera got smashed and then they stopped making the quick load film I was using. I had a couple of weird run-ins out. I work alone and I was like out in the landscape, under a dark cloth. And I had a couple of weird instances. I'm like, this is not happening. Like I need to, again, be able to move faster. And so the digital cameras were just sort of coming into being viable options for the kind of work I wanted. And so I ended up like with a digital back and a medium format old contacts and sort of pairing those two. And it's all kind of boring, but I think what I'm getting at here is that my roots are in working with large format cameras and the way that camera and the techniques required to operate those cameras and make photography and think about photography upside down and slow, I think still sort of carries over into the way that I think about photography. So let me go ahead and start sharing the screen so we can look at some images to sort of see what was happening at that time. So let's see, I can't see the chat with this up, I don't think, but maybe somebody can prompt me if there's stuff that anybody wants me to.
We've got eyes in the chat, I'll prompt.
Okay, good. Okay, so this is a project many of you may be familiar with. It was sort of my first body of work that I really presented publicly. It's called Southland. I started this work, it was my grad thesis project, and it was really about, I was living in West LA, where I still live, and commuting to Riverside. And I spent a lot of time on the freeway, on the 10 and the 60, sort of driving back and forth. And I think that this body of work was very much about, again, moving through the landscape with a camera. I was really interested in the edges of something. So like these places where maybe the city and this perception of wilderness sort of interacted on some level. I became very interested in using the language of traditional Western landscape painting in terms of the way that I could apply sort of that color language and maybe just sort of overall compositional style, but to a photograph and to these new inkjet printers that we were starting to work with. I should say the program at Riverside was 3 years long, and I spent the entire second year like fighting with machines and trying to figure out how to use them in a way that would allow me to articulate my vision. So I could just sort of show you a few of these as we go through. They were these beautiful big rag paper prints that were very delicate. but pretty amazing. And certainly as I was learning how to print and again, sort of put something in my head through a camera and onto paper. It was sort of these outskirts of Riverside and also closer to LA. A lot of these prints were large. Can you see my cursor, everybody? My little arrow here? You can, right?
Yes, your cursor.
So I sort of like that when you look at these, what was starting to happen is that they look sort of, I don't know, like idyllic or pastoral on some level, but then you'd see that there's like somebody's washing machine is in the bushes, or there's like a feral cat down there because there's a colony of feral cats that lives in the bushes. And as the prints got bigger, sort of these narratives would start to come out. And I really like that. Also, these places were changing all the time. You'd go once, there'd be nothing there. You'd go again, there'd be like the remnants of somebody's chain link fence or whatever. So it was sort of like, I don't know, Constable meets Caspar David Friedrich meets the Inland Empire with an inkjet is sort of where I was at with this. Again, it's like, it's sort of, I don't know, beautiful on one level, yet there's like an old mattress in the bushes, or, you know, somebody's big gulp cup down in the foreground. And I love that these things could coexist. Also at this time, about halfway through this project, I saw Robert Adams' Los Angeles Spring, which I hadn't seen before. And I was like, oh my goodness, he in the 70s or whenever that work was made was definitely like interested in sort of the same stuff that I'm gravitating towards now, like 40 years later. So that was sort of a revelation to me. So I just want to show this once more because I actually drove by here last week and took another picture, and this is what it looks like now. So I don't know, I thought that that was just sort of fun and crazy. You know,
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. I wanted to ask you, do you revisit the spaces that you photographed?
I don't, you know, and actually I was sort of hesitated to show this image because I was like, I don't want it to become a that was then, this is now, like before and after sort of thing. But it does sort of play into this longer way of thinking about how these places change, you know, even within the process of a couple of years of working on this project, I would go and like something would be there or not, or there'd be a tree that was suddenly cut down or whatever. So yeah, it changed.
Right.
There are like squirrels arguing outside my studio. So that was sort of Southland. And then I ended up in Death Valley, sort of at the end of Southland. And this body of work turned into a project called Captains of the Dead Sea. I made my first trip to Death Valley with my partner, my now husband, and we just went up there because I'd never been, neither one of us had ever been there. And the poor guy, like as soon as we drove down into the valley, I'm like, stop the car, oh my God. And it turned into like this next photo project. Like we thought we were just going to have like a weekend of like hiking or whatever. And suddenly it was like all about me and my camera. But I think what was so captivating for me, if anybody's been there, maybe you can relate. It's the sense of scale is just unbelievable. I think on the one hand, I think also, you know, I got there and saw things like this and I thought, okay, so this looks like Mars or the moon. Obviously, I've never been to Mars or the moon. And we all only know these places through images, whether they are nonfiction images from NASA, whether they are fictional representations of planets. I think Star Wars was actually filmed here in parts. And I sort of became really interested in this idea of playing with the idea of cinematic location, of one place standing in for another, and sort of investigating that a little bit and breaking that down. I think also I started thinking about how we first experienced images of space. And of course, that comes down to TV and newspaper. And I was actually not born during the moon landing. It was sort of the one thing that I wish I was a little, it's the one thing I wish I was a little older for. Everything else I'm fine with. But I was thinking about sort of the, you know, art in the age of mechanical reproduction and how images are spread throughout culture, how they operate. And so that's sort of where the seeds of this project were sort of planted. I'm going to let you sit on this for a minute because I had so many ideas going on at the time that I don't know if it's readable through the Zoom or not, but hopefully it is. I created this sort of, I don't even know what it is, a schematic to try to make some connections between everything and all the crazy stuff I was thinking about at the same time. I would say around this time, this is probably 2015 or so, Instagram was starting to happen. And it was clear that our relationship with images was changing. Our relationship with images and photography was never going to be the same again. Anybody everywhere, Michael, Holly, and I actually joke that everybody's a photographer from sort of our Grey Gardens joke, but literally everybody is a photographer now. And that's amazing. But make no mistake, it has changed how we interact with images and how images interact with us, I think. So I think that my first response to this sort of impending global image saturation was to make everything a single image. So not an edition, like I was done with the editions. And I think there was just like too much photography starting. And of course, we can talk more about that later, because I think that's sort of the state of the world at this point. But this is the time when I started beginning to make unique work. So all the pieces are unique. I started out working with newsprint for some of the reasons that I mentioned before, as a sort of a reference to how we experienced maybe some of these first images. Also, to be honest, I was so sick of making these big, perfect, beautiful Southland prints. They were really difficult to work with. And I just needed something that was a little more punk rock. And one day I had this roll of newsprint and I just shoved it through my printer, and it was kind of amazing. And so I started working with that. Of course, newsprint is like the worst artifact of anything, because it's like totally non-archival. But I liked the idea that people would save the newspapers as like to prove that this thing happened at this time. Like this was in the newspaper, it's the front page, there was the moon landing or the Challenger explosion or whatever. And we know now that that's a terrible artifact. And we also know that images really don't prove anything anymore. So I was super interested in that. And I can show you some of these images from this project. So not everything was on newsprint. I definitely did not want it to become a gimmick. However, each image was unique. I was also finding, as I was working through this project, that this work, whether I liked it or not, was sort of steeped in the history of photography on some level. Like I saw later that Ed Weston actually made an image from the same viewpoint in Death Valley. And so I was sort of contending with that as well. But it was really this whole idea of like using this location as sort of playing with the idea that it could be standing in for something else. And I didn't set out to create some like fake narrative or fake film and stills or anything like that. It's just more sort of a suggestion, I think. I'm also a big space nerd and included these sort of, stranger images, more abstract, that could be read as sort of maybe some sort of astrophotography. Honestly, it was probably just like a terrible lens aberration or flare. I'm pretty, I take an image. If I see it and I think it'll work in a project, like I will put it in the project, regardless of what it really is. This isn't one of the other pieces. This was not on newsprint. I just feel like always, you're sort of halfway expecting R2-D2 to come rolling through there or something. And actually, maybe that's because I actually do think they filmed a scene in here. This always gave me big Roger Fenton vibes. So this is Death Valley for the Crimean War, maybe. Here's one of the larger newsprint pieces. These were 40 by 50 or so. And they were kind of amazing because they, you sort of can't really see it. I mean, you can see some of the marks of the printer. Like the paper was so thin and the ink would just like bleed into this paper, because obviously it's not meant for any kind of photographic printing, really. And you would get these weird sort of creases and rips and tears. And I kind of love that. I also started making some aerial work for this project. This is one of the older newsprint pieces. The newsprint would change. They would start out as sort of this lighter gray color, and they would sort of come to their final resting place as this sort of yellowy thing. This is one of the other large newsprints. You can see there's like these sort of creases that were in the paper, in the prints that were, it was just sort of like you're in control of it, but you're really not in control of it. Was also playing with the idea of sort of the spread of the newspaper. I framed these in these very plain sort of aluminum frames. I remember I'd gone to LACMA and seen the Stanley Kubrick exhibition, and they had all of his notes and sort of some schematics and drawings and stuff. And they were framed as sort of artifacts in these very nondescript frames. And so I sort of took it from that, like, how would you frame an artifact, maybe? this is sort of, it was this idea of maybe you were sort of on approach or landing on this planet somehow. So then, of course, I had to make a newspaper because that seemed like the next logical step. And this was an artist's book. And I had a idea of making this to be like, I don't know, I was going to make like 25 or 50 of them. And they were so hard to make that I think I made 10 and called it quits. I'm like, yeah, I'm done with that. And so again, it's sort of playing with the idea of these images that are in our collective conscious. But then, like I said, the printer finally broke from the newsprint. So I was not a big fan of that. Luckily, Chris Pickler from Israeli came along and he's like, I love the newspaper. Let's do a book of this work. So we did a small one picture book of this work just during the beginning of lockdown. I remember like on March 13th, 2020, driving to his place to drop off my match prints for this. So it was super crazy. Here are just a couple images from the book. I think Douglas may have a couple of these left. I'm not sure, but that was the print that came with it. So this is an installation that I did with, I showed this work with Hannah Sloan at Sloan Projects. I remember one of my proudest moments actually is that we got hate mail from somebody who was like, how dare you show photographs on newsprint? And I was like, oh, I think we're doing something right if we're eliciting that sort of response from somebody. So I was super excited about that. So now we are at the erasures, and it's like, how did I go from desert newsprint to erasing my photographs? And I think, you know, I mentioned Instagram a little bit ago, and I think that that obviously is something that I don't know whether every photographer thinks about it, but I certainly do. I think it is our relationship to imagery and how it has changed so much in the last 10 years is probably the driving force behind, not the driving force, but a driving force behind the way that I think about my work now. I've been quoting for the last couple of years that, you know, Instagram, that 100 million images are uploaded to Instagram every day. And that seemed like a pretty impressive figure. And then I actually looked it up in preparation for today. And it's at 1.3 billion images are uploaded to Instagram every day. So 85% of the world's population has a smartphone, which means 85% of the world's population has a camera. And I'm all for that. Like, I think that's wonderful that everybody has access to photography now, because for, you know, a solid 100 years of photography or whatever, it was very rarefied. So the democracy of everybody having a camera in their pocket is amazing. But for me personally, it's sort of like, okay, so I'm working with photography, and what is it that I'm doing at this point that is contributing something new to the conversation? Like, how am I continuing this conversation? Like, what is it that I can make or do that actually I feel like deserves to be made into an object as opposed to something that is just sort of scrolled past? And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just like, that is not where, that is not the kind of work that I want to be making. So I started thinking about that, like how, like, what does that look like materially? And I also have been thinking a lot about sort of structures of power, as Bayley noted in my very fancy bio at the beginning. And I had this idea the whole time. And Michael Hawley and I remember sitting down at Proof Cafe and we were talking, and I was like, I really want to puncture the photograph. Like, I feel like something needs to puncture it. That was the word I kept coming back to. And we talked actually about like the slashes in the Fontana paintings, or Fontana, I don't know how to say his name. And I know, Douglas, you've talked or put that in the context of Chris McCaw's work. And, you know, it was something like that. I was thinking about that, but I didn't really want to slash it. And of course, now that I, you know, have spent some more time with Chris's work, it's like, oh, that's sort of his beat and he does it so well. And it wasn't really the right choice for me anyway, but I did want to do something to disrupt the surface of the print. I'd also thinking a lot about failure, systemic failure, also when sort of structures let us down. Been thinking, you know, I'm a Gen X person, and I think we all watched the Challenger explode as school kids, and it was sort of like that was the end cap of the era when space and technology and space travel, you know, like that beautiful, beautiful promise of technology saving us all that, you know, maybe my parents had from the moon landing and believing in all that stuff, like that had ended. We just watched people explode on TV. So I was thinking about failure. I was thinking about puncturing. Brett Kavanaugh happened around this time in those hearings, and I was just feeling really erased. And that this wasn't a literal translation of that, but I was just feeling like, how are these systems letting this stuff happen? But I was also thinking about containment of power. I was thinking about rare types of lightning, aurora, meteors, rockets, any kind of like UFO, or the new word, unidentified aerial phenomena. Like, I love that. Like anything that is sort of falling or floating through space that is sort of out of our control on some level, like that is interesting to me. Maybe it's benevolent, maybe it's destructive. The less sort of pin downable it is, the better. So what happened was I arrived at this idea of like, oh, I'm gonna put neon on these prints. And somehow they're just going to be like these streaks of like literally contained power, because what is neon but ionized gas that turns into a plasma? So it's literally like a containment of power somehow attached to this photograph. And I got to tell you, I tried and I tried. Like I often work with small 8x10 prints. I work digitally when I'm sketching ideas out as well. This is like a digital sort of sketch of how I was trying to figure out how to get neon on there. And I just couldn't make it work. I did go and visit a friend of ours, owns a neon shop. I spent time with him. This is actually his sort of sample board. There were like 9 different types of white and like 12 different types of red. And I'm like, this is for me, but I just couldn't make it work. And like was trying and trying. And then I was reminded about the great work by the painter, LA-based painter, Mary Weatherford. And I knew this work and I'd seen it before and I'd kind of forgotten about it. And I saw it again. I'm like, oh, man, that is exactly what I'm trying to do. She's doing it really, really well. That is like her jam. And there's got to be something else. But, for me in this project. And I had, marks like this on 8x10s and pretend that's a grease pencil. And I was trying to move the grease pencil around. And I basically tried to rub the grease pencil off and the pigment came off with it. And I had this like white mark, this eraser mark on my print. And I was like, this is what I've been looking for without even knowing it for like the last 6 or 9 months or however long. It'd been way too long. I was like struggling with this. So that was sort of the genesis of the eraser. It was, these are now my tools for like photography. Let's see. This is one of the first pieces I did. This is actually sort of how I saw originally the neon, maybe working on it or something. And then this was the 40x60 print that I had on my wall. And I just picked up an eraser and started erasing and making marks. And this was the first piece and it kind of ended up like that. So I knew that I was maybe on the cusp of some sort of language and mark making. I don't know, it's very uncharted territory. I mean, as I mentioned, it's like I went to film school and I think about photography and from sort of a classic standpoint, but suddenly I was erasing my prints. So I'm just going to show you a few images of things that I've been looking at when I think about the mark making and sort of the development of that. So
can I hop in really quickly? I have a question.
Yeah, totally.
Just a quick preface question.
Yeah.
Michael Hawley. He said, did the solar flare on the R2D2 quote unquote piece in Death Valley have any influence on these erasures early on?
That is a good question. Thank you so much, Michael, for that. Yes and no. No, in that I think it was just sort of one of those things that I didn't see at the time, when I was making that image until I got it back and started looking at it. But yes, in that it spoke to me on some level. And I think it may have been less about the specific nature of erasure and more about like, what is the laser beam from space doing in my photograph of the desert? I don't know. I was intrigued for sure that maybe there was something more at play or something more happening, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
So I'm interested in weird upper atmospheric phenomena. I don't know how many people are familiar with these sorts of things. I certainly wasn't until I did some research, but let me just as sort of a reference point here. So the troposphere is where airplanes fly. So this is like 40,000 feet down here. So this stuff is high up there. The blue jets are amazing. The red sprites are incredible. They just recently started photographing these things. The elves, the scientists knew existed, but actually couldn't prove it. But like somehow they somehow they couldn't photograph them. They have started being able to do that now in the last couple of years, but there's so much more going on up there than we realized because, we're down below. Also, as I mentioned, the Challenger explosion. I'm kind of like wordless when we come to this. The way in which, again, this is from the New York Times at the time, but the way in which these disasters or events were documented and presented to us. So again, maybe that traces back to Captains of the Dead Sea a little bit. This is, Douglas and I have talked about this. This is Columbia exploding over Texas. So this is more sort of the millennial, maybe the space disaster for the millennials. I don't know, but it's, I don't know, that's a whole other thing. So also any kind of missile tests, these things are these missiles that you get more bang for your buck. You send up one rocket and then it splits into like 8 different ones and then comes down. So you only have to pay for one launch, I guess. There's sort of, this looks like a Jack Goldstein piece to me. Certainly the Trinity test explosions. I was looking at a lot of vintage photography of that. I have cousins in Los Alamos and I went and visited there one time. And I think from this, I take maybe the color palette, the sort of lurid yellow, red, orange, the burning nature of it. These are some more missiles. So these are the Navy UAP videos. Maybe you've seen them. They're kind of amazing. I was also thinking recently about like the Chinese spy balloon that got shot down and how in the weeks after that occurred, like all of our radar started becoming recalibrated, becoming more sensitive. So suddenly we could see more and more in the sky that we couldn't see before. And the idea that, which is why we shot down, 5 more things in the next 2 weeks or something, and it was crazy. But the idea that, like, look, the universe is, what do they say, 95% dark matter, and we can't really quantify it beyond that, but we don't know what it is, but we know it's there. And I was starting to think about maybe the erasures, or actually to Michael's point, that one image of the flare and the Death Valley image, like maybe we're just not looking in the right way. Maybe these things, like if we recalibrated our radar a little bit, we could see more than sort of the visible spectrum. That's why they have infrared and radio telescopes. We look in different spectrums when we're studying space. Because our visible spectrum is like that big, and actually the electromagnetic spectrum is, huge. So I'm not quite sure how that plays into the way I think about this, but that is something that I'm thinking about. This was another test explosion from the 60s over the Pacific, I think. So here's like an action shot so you can see, like, essentially here's how it works. So almost all of these photographs that I made for All That Is Solid are these aerial images that I make while flying over the American Southwest. I sort of see this as working in a mode of like fake reconnaissance or like photographic surveillance. I love looking at old, sort of early surveillance photographs as well. The idea, and again, that sort of plays into my interest in like structures of power, sort of who is visible versus invisible, who has the camera, who does not have the camera, who gets to decide what you see in an image, who gets to decide what you see, or if you see the image at all, that kind of a thing. So I sort of see these, or the way that I work with a camera and the images actually is sort of in this mode of, I don't know, like a scientific and or playing with this idea of, the military industrial complex, or again, this idea that, we can provide like some sort of digital proof to what it is that we're seeing. Let me move on to a couple more of these. Then after that, I would print the images in my studio, and then they become, on the wall. And then that's when I started erasing them. This is a pretty good example. Like, what the hell are those things? Like, I don't know what those things are, but they're there. And I kind of like the idea that we don't know really what they are. Julie Meritou is one of my favorite painters. And I was reading an interview with her, and she said that the hardest thing about her work is knowing when to stop and not overworking the piece. And that's something I think about a lot, because it's sort of a one-way road here. And it's like, if you overwork one of these, like, it's sort of game over. You have to start again. I will say that to the idea of unique pieces, for each image, there's only one print and there's only one erasure. So I will not, for example, take this image and do a different type of erasure on it. Like once that image has been printed and erased, that image is made, that piece is made. So I've only had a couple of times, I think, where I've truly overworked something or just worked it in the wrong direction. I'm like, that is in the garbage bin now. So, because unlike painting, I just can't, like when it's done, it's done. So it's, you know, for me, this is sort of like this brave new world of thinking about image making and mark making, because obviously I don't have a background in mark making of any kind. Like I've never been a painter. Photography is sort of the instrument I play, you know, like that is how I know how to articulate what's in my head is through photography, more or less. So I think I'm also interested in, for sure, this idea that through erasure, it's this perceived sort of negative lack, but it actually becomes a presence. I feel like I'm sort of inserting my own voice, my embodied hand into this otherwise digital and mechanical process. I think that's a pretty important part of it overall. And again, the idea is sort of like I get to sort of decide, I don't know, it's sort of like going back to the Kavanaugh trial, it was like, oh, you're going to erase me? Okay, well, I'm going to, you know, hear it. I'm taking that erasure and it's going to turn into like a voice of some level. So, you know, I don't expect that to necessarily come through in the work, but that's certainly how I think about the mark making on some level. Like it's adding a vocal track to maybe an all instrumental song, and you can't not hear the vocal track. It's just sort of impossible to ignore. So I think,
I have a question actually on that subject.
Yeah.
How do you determine the marking gesture, right? You know, whether it's from the X or Y axes, because it does take on a body of itself, doesn't it? The presence of erasure.
Totally. It does. And let me see. So let's go back to one of these. So these are like 40 by 60, sort of deliberately. I'm not just working at that size, but I have been making work at that size. I like that size. I've made some smaller pieces too, but it is my body size, and the verticality, it's like me, you know, like looking at those images of me erasing, it's like, that is sort of my size. So yes, it is the idea that it comes up as like an artifact of performance came up in a couple of conversations I've had. I don't think of myself as a performer though. Maybe it's more like mark making, like cave paintings, sort of like I am here kind of thing. I'm obsessed with like prehistoric art. So I think it may be more of that, although I am interested in the idea of, I don't know, maybe it's more of, performance. I'm not sure if it's the right word, but certainly it's a mark of the physicality and my engagement as an artist with my body and the photograph, I think is sort of where it's at.
Right. Thank you for engaging that, Alia.
So some of them, so this is a triptych that we almost put in the Touch the Sun show. It's just a little too big, we felt though, for that room, but it's 3 40 by 60 panels. So it's 60 by 120 inches. So it's a big piece. It was sort of loosely based on, again, going back to the Challenger and thinking about that. But, you know, anything that reads is one thing or another specifically, like I sort of lose interest in it, sort of the more determined it is. So the sort of vagueness isn't the word, but the mutability maybe or an interpretation of what this thing is or could be, that's when it becomes really interesting to me. I should also say this was sort of playing with the idea of, you know, the last moments, so to speak, of, you know, something it's like capturing Muybridge style, maybe 4 stills of the same event over time. This is how I've been framing them. I frame them, they're mounted to aluminum and then framed in a brushed aluminum, super thin, almost blade-like frame. My brief to my head, you know, through my head, as well as to the framer, was like, make it look like aerospace. Like I want this to be like, it could have been milled for some sort of aerospace project. You can sort of see how they just sort of float in there. This is one of the smaller pieces. This is a 20 by 30 piece, which is just different, like it's more sort of like torso size. I am working on a project now, which I'll briefly touch on at the end of this in a couple minutes, that will probably be 20 by 30s. It's just it's a different size. It's a different way of engaging with the piece. And it sort of also allows me to, I think, continue to develop this language. I think the verticality, Bayley, to your point, that is because my arm works this way better than this way in terms of like actually making a mark. But we'll see. That's sort of TBD, as the work continues. This piece, Douglas actually saw this piece in the studio, and I've started printing a little bit on the silver paper, which I really like because it's, that's the dream, to have silver in your your photography. It's interesting to me. This looks like sort of a daguerreotype gone awry or something, which I liked. And Douglas had, people come to the studio and they're like, what about this? Have you tried this? And everybody just has all these suggestions. And, some of them are good. Some of them are bad. Most of them don't work. But Douglas had this one. He's like, have you tried like including some sort of liquid or something? I think is what you said, to like help maybe assist with the erasure, just to see how that works. And during lockdown, I got really interested in working with scent, which I'll talk about as I don't want to say perfume, because perfume kind of tastes like wearing it on your body. I'm much more interested in like environmental scent. And I'll show you a little bit about that in a few more minutes. But basically the crux of that is I have more ethanol in my studio to like explode all of West LA. So I started using, sometimes, not always, but like a little bit of perfumer's alcohol, which is like 99% ethanol or something, and incorporating that with the actual just hand eraser as well. And it just sort of created these different types of marks, which is pretty interesting. On the silver paper, it does one thing. On the white paper, it does a completely other thing. And so I've been working on that a little bit. It actually even ends up, this is a detail of this piece, a couple of details. You actually end up sort of stripping down the paper. So maybe that's my puncture after all, now that I think about it.
Right.
But I mean, it's sort of inadvertent, and it just does it with the silver, like with the sort of the other paper that I work with, the more white paper, it just sort of mushes stuff around, almost like a watercolor, like the ink, it sort of becomes dislodged a little bit and it kind of smears. This stuff actually takes a layer off, which is, interesting. So here's some installation images of the current exhibition at Marshall, called Touch the Sun. This work is all from a body of work called, my erasures, this body of work is called All That Is Solid, which I took from, actually I have the book. It's the Marshall Berman book, sort of a classic, The Experience of Modernity. So I don't know, I feel pretty ungrounded in modernity. As you can see, it's like the one book that has moved with me since undergrad days. Like everything else sort of got tossed by the wayside. But it just felt like kind of an apt title for this feeling of general, maybe unmoored, free falling, floating, it's a hard time. Here's another piece. So this is all in the back room. I was so happy with this installation, and Douglas, I have you to thank for that. It's just, I think they look amazing back there. I had been so used to seeing these pinned to my wall in my studio, and sort of their work from home mode, and to see them sort of framed and hung and lit, and especially against this black wall, that I know you always sort of keep that back room with. I just thought they like got dressed up and went out to the party, and I was just super excited to see them finished like this. So I have you to thank for that. This is one piece that I didn't have any, this is in the exhibition. I don't have any installation images of, I'm not quite sure why. This is a 20 by 30. Obviously this is actually, instead of in an airplane looking down at the desert, this is me in the desert actually looking up at the night sky. And I think I'll be working on some more space-based images coming up. I have, obviously this one on the wall right here, and just sort of playing with this a little bit more, different marks, maybe different images. Oh, there it is framed. That's at the framer actually. So this is the piece that's in the exhibition. And some details. I incorporate a little bit of scratching in there. I don't, I may continue with that. I may not. There were these marks in these images from these space images are so crazy because you look at them and you think one thing, and then the more you sort of enlarge it and look at it in Photoshop, like in the raw image, like more and more comes out, and it becomes very difficult to tell what is actually in the image and what is just noise. And that's something that signal to noise demarcation is super interesting to me. I think moving forward, that's something I'm going to think about. Also, like some of these marks, you end up with these satellites, like traces of satellites. Like I think I may have added that one, but this one was actually in the image, and you don't see these when you're photographing them. It's not until, again, it's this like stuff is happening out there, but maybe we're just not looking at it in a way that reveals everything to us until we sort of process an image or change the bandwidth or change, the color channels a little bit. And then these stories come out of all the stuff that was there that we just didn't know about. This is this piece in the installation. This is another one. Some details on this as well. This is also on the silver paper. So it had some of these places where the silver actually peeled off. So now I get to talk about scent, which I'm super excited about as well. So actually a couple of years before lockdown, I'd been thinking about, is there a way that this work can be experienced sort of more dimensionally? Like, is there a way that the work on the wall can be supported by some other aspect as well? I think the only way I can sort of describe it is like how you make a film and then you add music to the film. And the music should not be overpowering. It is there to support overall sort of the visual work, and the two work together. So I've created this scent installation here with the lava rocks of a scent that I have designed with my lab, which I think I have a picture of here. There's a close-up of that. And the idea is that it's ambient, it's quiet, it's invisible, but you can't see it, but it's still in the room and it has something to say. And the analogy that I've been making is the Wim Wenders movie, Wings of Desire, when Peter Falk is walking along and he can't see the angels around him, but he can feel them. And he's like, I can't see you, but I know you're there. And that is how I want the scent to be incorporated into the visual work as well. So this is the lab. I went to Crazy Town during the pandemic. Basically, I'd had this idea, had no technical knowledge of how to execute the idea. I knew nothing about scent. And there's this amazing, brilliant place called the Institute for Art and Olfaction. It's in Chinatown in LA. And during lockdown, all their classes went online. And I just started taking, like, I'm the person that took like every class for like a year and a half. And they were both technical classes. They have a whole series on scent and society and sort of the history of scent within society and how it has been used across millennia, across cultures and traditions. And it's fascinating. And what I quickly realized is that scent operates halfway between photography and maybe a time-based medium like film or music. So it taps into memory in a way that might be even sort of more quicksilver than photography. Like if you smell something, like for example, if I smell the scent of freshly cut grass, like it takes me immediately back to like terrible summer camp, Whereas if I smell maybe the sweat of a horse or something, it's like nothing but amazing goodness. And so the way that scent is processed in the brain, like it does not pass go. Like you can't unsmell it. Like you can't disconnect those two things, your memory and the scent. And at the same time, it is time-based because the way you design these things is that they have top, middle, and base notes. The top notes burn off, you're left with the middle, and then you're left with the base after a certain number of hours. And so it very much works like music or film in that way. But I have to say it was very humbling. It still is, learning to work in a new medium. As I mentioned, like photography is the thing that I understand well. And to just like learn how to work with scent has been very rewarding, humbling, frustrating, and brilliant, sort of all at the same time. And I will never be like a fancy French trained nose, as they call them. I'm very sort of, again, punk rock in the way that I work with scent. I've got like 3 chords in the truth, and that is sort of it. And I sort of figure out just enough to make it, again, to sort of get this idea out of my head and into the air. It also occupies this really interesting space to me that's halfway between material and immaterial, visible versus invisible, all these things that I've been thinking a lot about with the visual work as well. This is sort of how I go about designing a scent. Again, I'm back to like this sort of schematic thing where I have these ideas and then try to like connect them somehow. In scent, and maybe in most things, but in scent, you create meaning sort of one of 2 ways, either through similarity or through contrast. So this is sort of something I've been working on for these more space images, for example, like this. And it's just sort of the idea of like how I have these ideas and how do I connect them? And then how do you actually translate that into actual, materials and chemicals? And by the way, like chemistry was not my forte. Like the only F I ever got through school was in the chemistry section of like a photo class, because I totally failed that. So the piece I'm working on now back there actually started out as this. I had again, it was this idea of signal to noise sort of interference. And I'd added a bunch of stars and then added some additional sort of, marks of the satellites and stuff. And then it sat on my wall and it just wasn't enough. And so I just put it back up a couple of weeks ago and started, erasing it again. And then I overworked it, which, is that pitfall. But then I decided to overwork it some more. So I don't know what's happening with this, but that's where I'm at with it. In 2013, I went to the Arctic and have an opportunity now to go back to the Arctic next year in terms of sort of next projects. The Arctic is a sort of whole other project, which I won't spend any time with today, but it turned into a 3-channel video installation that was, I haven't shown it yet. We finished it just like as lockdown was happening, but I'm super excited to actually have this projected and installed somewhere. I worked with the incredible composer Tashi Wada, who designed or wrote a short score for it. It's about 10 minutes long. And I'm super excited to go back up to the Arctic and see sort of what I come back with now. This is where I'm going again. I saw this image yesterday. I'm like, I don't know why I've agreed to go back there, but this is what's happening and something amazing will come of it. And then this is sort of what's on the table right now. This is a book project that I'm working on. Chris Bickler from Nazreli has a new imprint coming out called Anatole, in which he has paired visual artists with musicians. So I've actually been paired with the musician Julia Holter, who is actually Tashi Wada's partner. They're both amazing, like artists and amazing human beings. And I'm super excited to be working on this book with her. I'm like 3 months behind on this book. So Chris, if you're out there, it's happening. And it just sort of like, again, working through a lot of sketches. These are just digital sketches where I take an image that I have and then sort of work it a little bit and then maybe sketch digitally some marks on it and then make just quick laser prints. Like I have 500,000 laser prints around my studio. And so that sort of brings us up to date for where I'm at.
Thanks so much, Alia. I mean, that was a wonderful presentation.
And I just realized I'm super behind now too.
It's okay. That's why I kind of turn on my camera to kind of get us there.
Prompt us. You should just said it's like too long.
But it was perfect. We can talk for a little bit. People will linger with us a little longer if they want to. I have one thing that I want to ask initially, Alia, and then I want to pose something to Douglas, and then we'll hop to the chat.
Yeah.
So Alia, one thing that was really excited about me besides all of it, because I'm also a space nerd and I'm thinking about all the things, but what is the locative device for you? How do you find that? We know that that's very common and obvious in photography, especially when we're finding the view shed. You even mentioned spaces that were photographed early on prior to you being there. But what is that space for you? Can you talk about that a little in depth? More
I think I need a little bit more. What do you mean locative space?
Device in the projects as far as land. How do you decide where you're photographing? Where in the sky are we? But then also through color,
sure,
material.
I don't think that's a rational decision. I think I just work through stuff. And if it strikes me as interesting, then I sort of go down that rabbit hole a little bit. And it's the project just sort of emerges on its own. And it's just, man, it's like faith-based on some level.
Right.
It's just, you just have to trust it. Like I have a few images with like horses happening over there. I don't know what's happening with those. I'm not sure if I'm ready to bring like horses into my work, but it's like, you just have to like allow the project to like happen and not courage is like admitting the fear and then just moving on. So I just sort of let the project dictate to me sort of what it wants to be and where it wants to go. And that, maybe that's not a sort of concrete enough answer for what you're sort of talking about, but it's not prescribed at all. Like I'm not like, I'm going to Death Valley and I'm making this work. It's much more intuitive in the way that I think about it.
Totally. And concrete or not, I think that there's something that's wonderful about this series and also your work in general, which has this intention to it, every gesture, every moment, but it's also, like you said, full of faith. And there's a lot of different elements that
I don't know. You have to trust the invisible on something. I don't know. I just read the Rick Rubin book and he was like, you got to trust the source. I'm like, yes, you do.
Right. You also reference the source and all of that. So, Douglas, I actually want to ask you as well. So this is a 3-artist exhibition. It was very, very intentional for you to have Alia in the exhibition. So can you talk a little bit about the artists that you chose and also the subject matter? They perfectly align. For any of you who might not have visited the exhibition yet, it's really well curated, very tightly done. So I just want to kind of bounce it to you, Douglas, to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. Thanks for the compliments. And man, I wrote down so many notes. Alia, we're gonna have to continue in next.
Oh my gosh.
Talk. But in terms of the show, I mean, it definitely started with Chris McCaw's work. That was sort of the initial catalyst, and somebody I'd been pursuing to exhibit for a number of years. And I really I always have this concept of it being a dialogue gallery. I like doing group shows. I like doing 2 and 3 artist shows and finding some kind of dialogue. That's usually where my curatorial brain kind of is ignited.
Right.
And so it definitely started with Chris's work. And once we secured that as the exhibition, there was a contribution of Roger Ackling's sculpture, which are these little wooden sculptures that have been burned using an optical lens as well. That was sort of a middle of the night idea to include Roger's sculpture as many of you may know, the artists that I try to show for the most part tend to be in the photo sculptural realm, either making unique pieces through physical engagement, like in Alia's piece, Alia's example, or photochemical manipulation. And so bringing in artists who do painting or sculpture primarily, but has some kind of photographic inroads. And then, this dark room here in the back, as many galleries have what they call a project room, project space, is, I try to use it to introduce an emerging artist, a new artist, or somebody maybe like Alia, who's been active for a while, but is new to me, is new to most of my audience, and to kind of show sort of an exciting new body of work that is maybe in the early stages, but has, as we see here, pieces that have definitely been taken to fruition and are successful, but is maybe just the tip of the iceberg of a project that's still ongoing.
Yeah.
And then there's the connection. It's always for me a thin line between having a few artists together who are doing things that are like too similar, that people then get confused when they come to the exhibition. But I think there's clearly enough departure in scale and in palette and in process between what Alia is doing and what Chris is doing. Even more fun for me when some or all of the artists are not familiar with each other to begin with. So yeah, I mean, obviously with Chris and Roger's work, they share a really close connection of using optical lenses to burn photographs or sculpture in their cases. And then there's of course the visual connection to Alia's work of the mark making on the landscape. And so that was, I had just been to Alia's studio and seen, these, I don't know, what was that, 6 or 8 months ago, when Virginia Heckert at the Getty was here to see one of my shows. And I may have even mentioned that I think I'm going to have a Chris McCaw exhibition, like all excited that I was, had secured Chris for a show. And she was like, do you know Alia Malley? Like you should go do a studio visit. And, of course, Virginia is one of those people, of course, people all the time are like, you should see my buddy Jim's photos. He's a great photographer. We get that kind of stuff all the time. But if Virginia Heckert makes a suggestion, I will usually take it. And to her credit as well, she put Chris's work on my radar for the first time, 10 years ago. So she's, I told her at the opening, she was the unknown co-curator of this exhibition, whether she knew it or not.
Thank you, Virginia, from us all.
I want to address Paula's question in the chat. Is that okay?
That's where we're going to next. We want to let Douglas finish up.
Oh,
No, that's all. I mean, I don't, like I said, we're going to do, I'll plug that we're going to do a walkthrough with Alia next Saturday, April 1st at noon. If anybody wants to come by for that, and I'll post some of the other notes. But I think that, the reason that I was, got into Alia's work among many factors, but as one of my other artists, John Brenton Hogan, talked about his own work going from straight photography to painting on his photographs, was that in the age of Instagram, he was consumed with a need to engage with his art, a need to physically, literally get his hands dirty making photography. And for some artists, that's in photochemistry, and some artists, it's physically altering the surface of their prints. And my sort of spidey sense that there was a lot of that coming, a great work in that space coming along, was really the catalyst for me opening my own gallery to focus in that kind of work. So,
I feel like these are all maybe strategies or conjectures to sort of address what we are all feeling, and so they turn out as erasures or painting or some other physical mark making or chemistry or whatever. But I feel like maybe they're all trying to address the same pressures that we're not even pressures, but just like world existence that we're all in,
Changes in technology, changes in memory, collective memory.
Yeah, well, for sure. And just how images operate culturally now, as opposed to how they did 10 years ago, and how much, that train has left the station, which is sad.
You just said it, not to mention visual culture. So we're going to have a conversation part 2 with Alia and Douglas, but let's hop to Paula's point.
Yeah, and thank you, everybody. I know it's like past time, so Paul, Paul and I have talked a lot about Web3 and NFTs over the past year, and because I know she had engaged with that community, and I had this weird thing last year where I broke my arm in a horse fall, and I couldn't erase, like big pieces. Of
course, right?
And it was like last February, and I couldn't work. And so I spent a lot of time just sort of researching and reading, and sort of fell into these NFT communities. And I have to say, the idea that a photograph doesn't necessarily have to be a print or a book, that it could just be a digital image, and especially a unique digital image, that is a very interesting idea to me. I ended up making a body of 12, I did an NFT project, although that word is so just tainted and problematic at this point. I made 12 8x10 pieces, and actually one of the little 8x10s with the eraser in it that I showed that was pink, that was from that, because I could make these sort of smaller marks, actually with my left hand. And I think what really was interesting to me was sort of conceptually, one, that maybe this was a new way for photography to exist. Now that the technology could support it. And also the idea, again, this idea of playing with the visible versus the invisible versus the materiality versus the demateriality. I called it the dematerialization of all that is solid. The second part of this book is melts into air. So I sort of felt like that was that half of it. And so the idea that I could take an image, the light would be translated into some sort of electromagnetic signal in the digital camera. I could put it into the computer, I could print it, I could insert my erasure into it, and then I would redigitize it. And then the redigitization of it, that would be the piece. And actually the 8x10 piece would stay in my archive as sort of the negative, so to speak. that I would keep. And so the piece would exist as only a digital image. And, you know, I did that project, and Paul and I have talked a lot about it. And it was really interesting. I met some really interesting people. I kind of feel like right now, that has run its course for me currently. I'm not, you know, maybe in the future there will be something else. I just feel like it's such early days still with the technology. It's really hard to engage with this blockchain stuff. Also, a lot of it is so bad, like so bad. And I just had a really big struggle with that. But that said, I know there are people making amazing blockchain digital stuff. But in the photography community, it was very small, very limited. And so I think it was just like super early, you know, like the people that started the YouTube, you know, 7 years before YouTube actually launched, it just like wasn't quite there yet. Mm-hmm. So, but, you know, photography and technology are like that. So I think that there is a future for it somehow. I don't know what that is, but I'm always up for trying something, and, you know, it worked, and maybe it'll work again in the future. But right now I think it's in the lull between the sets as you're sitting out in the ocean on your surfboard. So anyway,
that's a good note for us to kind of end on.
So, but again, I'm so grateful for Douglas for bringing my work together with Chris's and Roger's. I was super excited over that, and could not be happier with the way that the exhibition turned out. So
likewise, actually.
Same here.
Go ahead, Douglas. Sorry.
I just said same here.
Alia, Douglas, are you seeing the wonderful compliments in the chat?
I am. I love being able to see the chat. I don't know why I haven't, like, usually chats like over here, but thank you everyone for coming and for the amazing compliments and good questions and stuff. And Virginia, you definitely, I see you're here, you definitely deserve credit as co-curator. I love that. Also, I have to say, Virginia has really challenged me in a lot of the way that I think about my work, and in always a good way. So I'm really grateful for that.
Yes. Okay, there's one more comment from Michael Hawley. I don't know if you'd like to read that, Alia, but I think it's more of a comment rather than a question. Thank you so much for your comments and lovely compliments to Alia and Douglas here, everyone. And again, thank you for staying with us a little longer. Oh, go ahead, Alia.
Yeah, no, I was just reading Michael's comments. So it's interesting, the idea of myth that you're talking about. I am here, but these erasure works feel like Zeus, Athena. So somehow that is the next step. And you and I'm sure we'll have pastries and talk about it. But it's, yeah, the idea of myth, certainly as I started working with the horse images, the idea of Apollo's horses, literally, they pull the sun across the sky. Like, clearly that is something I'm going to read more about and think more about. So yeah, that is, those are early days for sure. You know, and I've done, like, I went to that Cy Twombly show a couple of times at the Getty while it was up, just sort of absorbed all that. So yeah, that'll be happening.
Yay, nice. All right, Alia, well, we look forward to revisiting you. Maybe we'll have a studio visit forthcomingly.
Yeah, anytime.
We'll keep following you. This is our second conversation with you since we started the series in 2020. So we're happy to have you here. Douglas, we look forward to more conversations with you too. And everyone, if you haven't visited Marshall Gallery yet to see the exhibition, please do. Douglas just put in the chat that they'll be having a walkthrough on Saturday the 1st at 12 p.m. with Alia and McCall. So join them in the space. And again, everyone, thank you so much for sticking here with us for 11 extra minutes. This is what we come here for. This is what we love to do. And have a good rest of your Saturday.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Have a good one, everyone.
Bye. Bye.